Today I want to talk about what is the fatal flaw of the zombie storyline. One of the most storyline breaking plot holes I've ever seen in zombies. We have a lot of plot holes. We have a lot of weird mistakes and anomalies, but this just outright doesn't make sense, and this all stems from the timeline. The thing about the timeline is Treyarch had the time to write out the entire zombie storyline, and this is where they can fill in those plot holes and make things work. But if anything, this has just created one of the greatest plot holes we've ever seen in the zombie storyline, and it all pertains to Richtofen's journey. I'm going to do my best to explain this. This gets really complicated, especially Richtofen's journey, because it involves him going back in time into the future and contacting his future self and creating infinite loops. It's very complicated, but I'm going to do my best to explain it, and hopefully this makes sense and you guys can see why there is a problem with this journey. We're going to begin with June 11th, 1943. Richtofen is contacted from the house by Maxis, who warns that the test subjects must never be allowed to awaken. The havoc that could be wreaked upon the future by such simple-minded individuals would be catastrophic. You guys might remember this radio from The Giant. This is in the Ultimus timeline. This is the timeline with the big swirl. It's the center one. This is what we played through much of World at War, all the way up until Black Ops 2. This is where the Primus Richtofen, or the Richtofen who goes on a journey, came from. You can tell because it's where the big concentric circle is. The concentric circle refers to Richtofen, and the large one indicates that it's the beginning of the journey. So this is where the Primus Richtofen came from, but this timeline's Richtofen is the evil Richtofen, the one that you might remember from previous Call of Duties, who looked like this. That is the Richtofen who actually went on the journey, the older 1940s Richtofen. So he goes on his journey, and then we have July 19th, 1943. Primus Richtofen is teleported to the house in Agartha, returning him with Maxis. So now Richtofen has gone on his journey, and he's been teleported to the house, and then we have this bit of the timeline. Richtofen's journey begins. Maxis tells Richtofen the plan to secure the Chronorium and locate the summoning key. Hearing the echoes of his other self, Richtofen discovers his connection with Samuel Stuhlinger and decides to use Victus to acquire the Chronorium. So let's just establish. The Richtofen who came from the Ultimus universe went to the house and now is about to go on a journey to get the summoning key and the Chronorium and work with Victus and go to Mob of the Dead is the Nazi Richtofen. This is the one from the Ultimus timeline. This is not actually the Primus Richtofen because he came from the Ultimus timeline. The thing is, the Ultimus Richtofen still exists in that blue swirl. So as Richtofen goes on his journey, Richtofens still exist in that timeline, weirdly enough. Suddenly, we have two Richtofens. We have a Richtofen going on a journey, and we have Ultimus Richtofen doing his thing, because we know he still exists in this universe, because later on in the swirl, the next time he's mentioned is July 15th, 1943. Richtofen travels to the Siberian facility to do further research on live specimens. As his temporary guardian, he takes Samantha with him. Group 935 begins transferring 3 test subjects for experimentation: Nikolai, Pablo, and Takio. This is also the same Richtofen, as you read through the swirl, that becomes part of Ultimus and goes on the journey that started with Shinonuma and ended with Moon, and then him eventually becoming in control of the pyramid. We have 2 Richtofens that spawned from one timeline. It's like they split into 2. So Richtofen continued in his timeline while also leaving his timeline and going to the house and beginning his journey. And this is where it starts to not make sense, because we have more Richtofens than there should be. And this Richtofen, Ultimus Richtofen, has somehow been turned into the Dimension 63 Richtofen. So this is the Dimension 63 Richtofen. And when you look at Richtofen in Shadows of Evil, they look the exact same. But if you read the timeline, this Richtofen actually came from the Ultimus timeline. So Richtofen somehow split into 2 people and at the same time transformed into the Dimension 63 Richtofen, which makes absolutely no sense. I know the zombie storyline gets weird and sometimes things are made up, But how is this even possible? This is where we start to enter weird paradox territory. So as we continue reading through the timeline, let's jump to Origins. Element 115 awakens the undead knights from the Great War and quickly consumes the camp. Maxis is rendered catatonic by the element. Richtofen removes his brain before he turns. Dempsey, Nikolai, and Takio unite with Richtofen on the battlefield and help free Samantha from her imprisonment in Agartha. Primus has been reunited. Samantha sends Primus to their next destination. Maxis' brains arise in Agartha, and Dr. Monty decides to step in. Monty brings Maxis to the house and wipes the corrupt Maxis completely from existence. So this Richtofen always existed in Dimension 63, and then when June 4th comes, he becomes part of Primus, and they get sent on their journey. But as we continue reading the timeline, Richtofen actually meets up with the crew in the Giant. You'll remember he disappears for 2 years. So we have two things going on in this bit of the timeline right here. October 15th, 1945, the Giant. As a zombie outbreak occurs, Primus, Dempsey, Takio, and Nikolai confront Ultimus Richtofen, moments after he teleports Maxis and Samantha. As they try to reason with him to wake their counterparts, Primus Richtofen arrives through the teleporter and kills his Ultimus self, triggering fractures across time and space. As Primus fights to the undead, Group 935 secures the density test subject and transports him to Der Eisendrache. Primus pursues them in a German Giant. This is where everything really starts to get messed up. If we look at the arrows in the timeline, we have two groups converging in one area. We have Primus and we have Richtofen, but only Primus leaves. Now, Ultimus Richtofen always existed in that timeline. This is the timeline he belongs in. But we also have Ultimus Richtofen turning into Primus Richtofen and then showing up at the Giant to reunite with Primus. And whatever happened to the Origins Richtofen? In theory, we should have two Richtofens converging on one spot, as well as the Ultimus Richtofen. There should be 3 Richtofens in the Giant. However, there are only 2. There is a missing Richtofen. Whatever happened to the Richtofen from Origins? Because this is the Richtofen from the journey that he went on. We know this because he has all of the knowledge and stuff that he acquired on his journey. The summoning key, everything he has came from that Richtofen who teleported in and then killed the Ultimus Richtofen. But he's also the Ultimus Richtofen. This is really complicated, and this is really difficult to explain because Richtofen leaves his own timeline, but still exists in the timeline, and then becomes a Richtofen from a different timeline, and then that Richtofen from that timeline disappears from existence completely without it being mentioned in the timeline. It's this weird and crazy plot hole that makes absolutely no sense, and you'd think because Treyarch took the time to write out the entire zombie storyline that a plot hole like this could be fixed, and it's such an easy plot hole to prevent. It should have never existed. Here's what should have happened. Ultimus Richtofen should not have been the one to begin the journey. He should have stayed in his timeline and continued to be the evil Richtofen. What should have happened is that Primus Richtofen gets separated from the group after Origins, and then he goes to the house and begins his journey and meets up with the crew at the Giant. Primus should have been split up, but that's not what happens. Primus, as a group, according to the timeline, moves on to the Giant. None of this makes any sense, and this is my biggest problem with the zombie storyline right now. It was such a simple problem to fix. The Richtofen from the journey should have been the Richtofen from Dimension 63, and that's what you would think when you look at Richtofen in Shadows of Evil, who is dressed like Dimension 63 Richtofen. I'm frustrated. This is annoying. I love this story to bits, and it's been such a fun journey to follow, but this really breaks things. And everybody tries to make excuses for why things in the zombie storyline don't make sense, or why things aren't quite right, or maybe things are out of place or out of time. But honestly, this is just unexcusable because this breaks the entire story. And maybe Jason is watching this video right now laughing to himself because he knows something I don't know. But just given the information available, given the timeline, which should make sense when you read it, None of this makes sense. That's going to wrap things up for this video. If you enjoyed it or found it interesting, let me know. If you enjoy following me down this rabbit hole of madness, maybe give it a like, possibly subscribe for more. Or if you figured this thing out, and clearly I haven't, please do let me know, because I am open to suggestions and explanations. But for right now, I don't understand. I'm going to go, though. Have a wonderful day, and bye.